What's going on, folks? Gaston right here, and Sony finally launched today the Sony A7C Mark II and the Sony A7CR. Now, I was hoping to get the camera in my hands to make this video, but after responding to so many comments here in the prior videos that we made about those cameras when they were rumored, I decided to make this video. And to be honest with you, I own the Sony A7R5. I actually owned the Sony A7 IV, which I sold, and now I have two Sony A7C Mark I. So I think I'm pretty qualified to help you guys, with the decision in your camera purchasing. Perhaps may not be none of these cameras that Sony announced today, so we're gonna be talking about that in just a moment. Now, disclaimer, I'm not gonna be editing this video, or at least I'm not gonna try to edit this video, so if I mess up, I'm sorry. This one is gonna be a long take, and I have some notes right in front of me. So the first thing that we're gonna be talking about is the body, because when it comes to the Sony A7C Mark I, or the Sony A7C Mark II, or the Sony A7CR, we're talking about the same exact body that you see right here. And there is the notion that these bodies are super portable, but to be honest with you, when you actually pick up both cameras and you impose them like this all together, the differences are not that abysmal. Now, for example, when it comes to the length of the camera, as you can see right here, you're talking about almost the same height, maybe 4 millimeters taller, this one in that direction. And when you talk about the overall width of the camera, again, it's just about the same. I think this is a better way to show you. And again, you're talking about maybe another 4 millimeters in that direction or so. So yes, they are a little bit smaller, but are they that smaller? And are the compromises that you're gonna be making by going to a smaller body worth it, or worth the difference between the price of these cameras and the bigger bodies, which is the first thing that we're gonna talk about right now. So the Sony A7C Mark II is gonna cost you $2,200, whereas the Sony A7CR is gonna cost you $3,000. Now, to put it into perspective, the Sony A7 Mark IV is a camera that right now goes for about $2,500, but that's the price for a brand new one. And I'm assuming that a lot of people are gonna start offloading some of those cameras, perhaps because they want something smaller, or perhaps because there may be a Sony A7V coming up soon, and we're gonna start seeing those cameras probably at a discount. Now, it is good to take that in consideration, because between a Sony A7C Mark II versus a Sony A7 IV, so many names, there's gonna be only $300 difference, and there are gonna be, in my opinion, some compromises that a lot of people are not gonna be able to negotiate with. Now, when it comes to the Sony A7CR and the Sony A7R5, which is this camera right here, the difference is gonna be bigger, because this camera goes for about $3,800, whereas the Sony A7CR goes for $3,000. So we're talking about $800 difference between the R and the Sony A7R5, and we're talking about $300 between the Sony A7C Mark II versus the Sony A7 IV. There you go, so many names. By the way, I think that Sony should have named the Sony A7CR Sony A7C Mark II R and Sony A7C Mark II, because next time when they release the version 3, it'll be easier to remember, and we're gonna have to talk about the Sony A7C Mark III and the Sony A7CR Mark II. I don't know, it's gonna be a mess. But anyway, so focus, Gaston. Now let's talk about the sensor. The Sony A7C Mark I is gonna have a 33 megapixel sensor, backside illuminated CMOS sensor, which is the same sensor, again, that we're gonna find in the Sony A7 IV, whereas the one on the Sony A7CR is gonna be the same sensor that we have in the Sony A7R5. So 60 megapixel, again, backside illuminated CMOS. Now let's talk about buttons and dial, because yes, there's gonna be a difference when it comes to the buttons and dials here, but that's gonna be pretty much the same difference. The grip, for what I've seen, is actually the same grip and not that deep. And when you compare with something like the Sony A7 IV or the Sony A7R5, you can actually see the difference in these grips. And in my opinion, if you're looking for comfort, this is not gonna be the most comfortable camera out there, no matter how you wanna put it out there. But one thing is that Sony, in the Sony A7CR, now is offering this camera with a grip that you can actually screw on into the camera. But in my opinion, at that point, I mean, just get a Sony A7 IV, or I don't know, it just doesn't look good in my opinion at all. And it kind of like kills the portability aspect of the camera by adding something else that doesn't even, in my opinion, doesn't even flow well with the camera aesthetics. But again, some people may find it attractive. Now, in the Sony A7C Mark II, that grip is not gonna come included. In the Sony A7CR, it's gonna be included. And if you wanna buy it, that's gonna cost you $150 for just a grip. Something to keep in mind. So the price keeps going higher and higher. Keep that in mind, because if you're thinking about Sony A7C Mark II plus the grip, well, you're right now at $2,350, whereas the Sony A7 IV costs you $25, and it already has an ergonomic grip that is much more comfortable and more buttons and a bunch of more stuff that we're gonna talk in just a moment. Now, again, dials and buttons, you're gonna get the front dial, just like Sony did with the Sony A6700, and you're gonna get another custom button right there next to the menu button, but that's gonna be pretty much it. Now, we're not gonna have a joystick like we have in both cameras, such as the Sony A7 IV or A7R5, and in my opinion, you know, the Sony A7CR, which is a camera that is $800 more expensive than the Sony A7C Mark II, should have had, you know, the best of everything. It should have a joystick. It should have a better EVF and screen. Speaking of EVF and screen, let's talk about those right now. Now, the EVF of the Sony A7C Mark II and the R is going to be pretty much the same. Basically, slightly upgrade from this one right over here. It's going to be now 2.65 million dots of resolution, but still, you're going to have a super tiny EVF. I believe it's a little bit more magnified now, so that may be a little bit more comfortable to preview, but still like super tiny. It doesn't have an eye cup, and I don't know, in my opinion, they should have done something better. Specifically because Sony is a display company as well, you know, and I would expect it from them to really knock it out of the park with more technology when it came to the EVF and the screen. Now, speaking about the screen is under 8 million dot in resolution in the Mark I, and in the Mark II, it's actually slightly above 1 million dot resolution. In my opinion, you know, the final result is going to be pretty much the same, which is poor. Now, one of the problems that I have with the Sony A7C Mark I is that a lot of the times, you know, gauging the actual exposure may throw you off if you actually peek through the EVF or the screen. Things tend to look overexposed in this camera. When you open the image, it looks amazing, but something that, you know, it takes some time to get used to, or completely ignore what you see on the screen and go by your settings. But it would have been nice to have something a little bit more legible, like, for example, on the Sony A7R5. And one of the things that I was expecting in the Sony A7CR, and perhaps a lot of you guys also were expecting, for Sony to give us something like this multi-angle screen that can tilt up and down and also flip out. And this screen is actually not only super practical for photography, but it's also great for videos, because when you have a lot of stuff connected right here in the ports, and you want to flip the screen, you know, you're going to encounter that, you know, if you have headphone jack or an HDMI, that you're going to be bumping towards them. Whereas with this implementation, you can simply pull it back, flip the screen, and still tilt in any direction, and it's not going to affect any, you know, it's not going to collide with the ports that you have connected right over here. So in my opinion, again, Sony charging $800 more than the Sony A7C Mark II should have given us, you know, a better screen. And in my opinion, the screen should have been this one right over here, and also the joystick. So we don't have that. Now keep that in mind, because those are things that if you really need that for your one only camera that you're going to be using for all situations, professional, commercial, and also personal projects, perhaps you want to have that flexibility. All right, let's talk about IBIS. Sony apparently has improved the IBIS in this camera. It's up to 7 stops of image stabilization right now, mechanical, versus the one that we have in the Sony A7C Mark I, which is 5 stops of image stabilization. Now, I've seen some videos in YouTube, and to be honest with you, for what I can see in the videos, it's pretty much almost the same as what we have right here in the Sony A7C Mark I. So again, I don't know how that's going to act when you couple a lens with optical image stabilization, how the two combined image stabilizations are going to handle. And I don't know if maybe the 7 stop is when you couple the camera with a lens with optical image stabilization. Something that, again, I haven't taken too much time to figure it out. But the one thing is that, you know, if you want the utmost image stabilization, you can engage in the active mode. And that's going to be, in my opinion, the best way to go by, and that's the best way that I actually go by right now when shooting video with any cameras, because Sony, no matter how better the image stabilization gets, nowhere near where Panasonic is, for example. And I think that they still have to catch up to that big time. So that's gonna be it. Now let's talk about burst shooting, because the Sony A7C Mark II, the cheaper camera, is gonna give you 11 frames per second, maximum up to 11 frames per second, whereas the Sony A7CR is gonna give you up to 8 frames per second less. Of course, you have more megapixel. There are gonna be some limitations there. Again, I think that people getting this camera are not gonna use this camera for sport photography, although you could, but like I mentioned before, some limitations with the EVF. The display, these displays are not known for being the brightest one out there, but it's a little bit brighter than the prior version. So, some people may find it just fine. Now, one thing that I want to talk about is the fact, and I discussed this in several videos, is that this camera caps at 1/4000 of a second in the mechanical shutter. Now, with the brand new 2 releases, we're going to be in the same situation, 1/4000 of a second, because these cameras don't have the full mechanical shutter as a bigger camera like this one. That's the limitation of 1/4000 of a second. Now, I think, it's not a big deal for me. 1/4000 is plenty of mechanical shutter, in my opinion. And when I need more, I go up to the electronic, which it gives you 1/8000 of a second shutter speed with the electronic one. Of course, the electronic one is going to introduce more rolling shutter effect and so on. But for most situations, you're going to be fine with the 1/4000 of a second. But in my opinion, once again, Sony on the Sony A7CR, they should have given us 1/8000 of a second with a mechanical and up to 1/16000 of a second with the electronic shutter. Now, one of the reasons why I've been shooting so much with a Leica M11, because this camera can go 1/16000 of a second, allowing me to shoot with lenses wide open, f1.4, no problem in super bright daylight here in Miami, and not needing to carry any filters. So that's gonna be very handy, or that could have been very handy if Sony would have had that in the Sony A7CR, but no. All right, ISO performance. And once again, not necessarily more and more expensive. It's gonna mean more for a lot of people, because the Sony A7C Mark II is gonna have an ISO up to 51200. And of course, then you can expand it to the higher shutter speed, but I will never suggest going that high ever. So 51200 for the Sony A7C Mark II and 32,000 for the Sony A7CR. So less than the Sony A7C Mark II. Of course, 32,000 is plenty of, in my opinion, plenty of ISO for that camera. And that's because of the higher megapixel resolution. Now, this camera right here, and this is side note, this is the Leica M11 monochrome. This one can go up to 1/200,000 of a second. And shooting at 1/50,000 of a second is like shooting at 1/5000 of a second, to be honest with you, with any of my Sony cameras. It's just unreal how much the Leica can go in ISO without introducing a lot of grain. Again, different technology. It doesn't have a Bayer filter, and I'm distracting myself already. Anyway, focus in here. Now let's talk about pixel shift, because the Sony A7CR will give you that focus shift image composition, which what it does, it uses the IBIS to move the sensor around, producing a larger image of higher resolution, a little bit above 200 megapixel. Now, this is only going to be available, like I mentioned before, in the Sony A7CR. And I don't know. I mean, I've never had a need for using more than the 60 megapixel that I have in this camera. Never had a need to do that. But if you need it, now you have it there in the Sony A7CR. It's going to cost you $800 more than the other one. So, of course, the main attraction to these cameras is going to be the latest autofocus that we have in the Sony A7R5. Now is actually implemented in these 2 new models, the Mark II and the R. Now, the autofocus in the Sony A7C Mark I, in my opinion, was just fine. But now we have human detection, animal detection, train detection, car detection, airplane detection, bugs detection, like incredible. But the only problem that I see with all those modes of autofocus detection is that Sony should have given us at least an automatic option where, we can choose if we want to go automatic or select ourselves. And this has happened to me several times that, you know, and I have it here in the Leica M11, does animal and human automatically. And basically, if I point the camera to a human, it's gonna, you know, snap the eye. No, this one, the Leica Q3. I'm sorry, I was showing the Leica M11. But on the Leica Q3, if you put the camera, you know, to a person, it's gonna recognize the eyes. And if you put it to an animal, it's gonna recognize the animal. And if you put it to an object, it's gonna recognize the object. And it does it automatically. And a lot of the times, 95% of the time, it works just fine. But I wish that Sony would have introduced that at least on the Sony A7CR. And we don't have that capability in any of the models that Sony just introduced. So if you are at a park or a place where you have animals, you have people running, you may have a train in the background or a person, whatever, you may have, number one, you know, needing to switch to different things. And for that, you're gonna have to invoke the menu and actually go there. So again, I'm sure that Sony can actually implement this for future firmware updates in upcoming months. And I think that they do, because it will be something really nice to have in the cameras. And Canon is already doing it. And some other camera companies also have the automatic detection of the different types of subjects. So something to keep in mind. Now, let's talk about, auto white balance and auto exposure has been, the algorithm has been calibrated to give you a more accurate representation of the temperature of the current scene, and also the exposure. That's gonna be welcome. Now, we are gonna see a big leap from the Sony A7C Mark I to these two new models, the Mark II and the R, and that's gonna be when it comes to the 4K in 10 bits. So this camera is gonna have 4K video up to 60p in 10 bit, 4:2, and you're gonna do it up to 60p, but the 60p is gonna incur a crop, and if I'm not mistaken, the crop is gonna be up to Super 35 in the Sony A7CR and 1.2x crop in the Sony A7C Mark II. Again, 60p, full frame camera, APS-C crop. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know how a lot of people are gonna feel about that. And that's where, you know, someone that is actually taking this camera to be a great video and a great photography camera may actually start thinking about the other options out there, like the Sony A7C Mark IV or the Sony A7RV. So something, again, to keep in mind, guys. Now, if you're a video shooter or a photographer that's gonna be shooting fast action moving subjects, rolling shutter in this camera is gonna be pretty much the same. Very similar to the one in the Sony A7C Mark I. It's not gonna be the best, and Sony cameras, the lower end cameras, are not known for having great rolling shutters. So it is said that probably in the Sony A7CR, you're gonna have a better improvement in rolling shutter, but we're not gonna see a vast improvement whatsoever from the prior version, Sony A7C I. Now with the Sony A7CR, you're gonna be able to output up to 16-bit RAW external using an HDMI recorder, and that's gonna be awesome. We're not gonna have that. I believe in the Sony A7C Mark II, that's not gonna be available right there. Now, when it comes to inputs and outputs, so pretty much we're gonna have the same thing that we had in the prior version. We're gonna have the microphone input, the headphone jack, the USB-C, and the ugly Sony micro HDMI port there. So Sony is not gonna be improving that. Now, when it comes to storage, we're also gonna have one SD card slot. And I'm fine with one SD card slot, and I was hoping that Sony potentially could introduce internal storage, but at least in the Sony A7CR, Sony could have introduced, you know, CF Express Type A compatibility with a single SD card slot, but no. And to be honest with you, at $3,000, I think that Sony should have made the Sony A7CR a dual card slot camera, because honestly, $3,000, we're not talking about anymore, you know, sub $2,000, which is still a lot of money, and you still can get cameras for even less than that with dual SD card. But a $3,000 camera from Sony with a single SD card slot, in my opinion, I don't know if Sony is trying to rush and pump cameras in the market just to overwhelm the competition or what it is. But to be honest with you, in this camera, in these two releases, we haven't seen anything new that we haven't seen already Sony doing. We also have the auto framing feature in both cameras that I don't know how many people are gonna use that feature. So we have a lot of those little things here and there that are cool, but how usable are those going to be? And this is where, you know, I wanna talk to you guys about, if you have $2,200, if you have $3,000, which camera you should get. And in my opinion, if you're determined to get one of these cameras, I think the Sony A7C Mark II is the camera to get, $2,200. And that would be a camera that I would own. Actually, that's the one that I'm pre-ordering. I'm not gonna be getting the Sony A7CR because I have the R5, and to be honest with you, I have a much more ergonomic grip, dual SD card slot with CF Express Type A compatibility. You know, I have pretty much everything I want. And this one also features, let me see right here, let me show you guys, because it's good to mention this, the full-size HDMI. And you're also gonna get that with the Sony A7 IV. So to keep in mind, you have to think about these two new cameras, but also think about the used market for those cameras right now, like the Sony A7 IV. You could probably get a Sony A7 IV used right now for the same price of the Sony A7C Mark II, and perhaps even lower. Go on eBay, go on OfferUp. That's where I shop sometimes my cameras. Be really careful. I'm gonna tell you, be really careful and try to buy from trusted sources. But many people may actually skip the Sony A7C Mark II altogether and maybe get a Sony A7 IV used. Now that camera also has its issues. You know, it may overheat after, you know, extended recording period of times. I never had a problem, and I use that camera very extensively. Has been my travel camera for a long time. And 33 megapixel is where I think it's at right now for me. You know, it's a great balance, you know, in high resolution without killing my storage capacity. When I'm on the road, dumping footage in the computer, dumping pictures on the computer, I'm not overwhelming my hard drive. So, you know, if you have $2,200 and you don't own any of these cameras and you want one camera, in my opinion, the Sony A7 Mark IV is going to be a better option, unless you need the bug out of focus, you know, the train out of focus, you need all those things. But yeah, that's how I see it. Now, the other thing is that when it comes to overheating, in my opinion, you will have better dissipation with those cameras. Like I mentioned before, with the Sony A7 IV, I never had any overheating issues. I hear people complaining about, but at least at the studio for this type of videos, not even once I got the camera overheating on me. Now, these smaller bodies are known to overheat. The Sony ZV-E1 is an example, a camera with 12 megapixel having overheating issues. Again, I haven't managed to burn that camera like some people have, but again, I use it here at the studio, and when I'm outside, I do small takes. Now, if you're trying to get a camera for video, in my opinion, the Sony FX30 or the Sony ZV-E1 may be a better camera, specifically the Sony ZV-E1 if you're not gonna be putting that camera in a tripod and shooting for 3 hours straight, you know, that's not a camera for you. But the Sony A7 IV or the Sony FX30, again, the FX30 is an APS-C camera. In my opinion, it's gonna be a better camera for someone that wants more of a video camera. Now, for those that want resolution, the higher resolution, you know, 33 is not cutting it for a reason, and you just wanna have top resolution. Well, if you're gonna be spending $3,000, how far away are you from maybe a couple of $100 more? Because right now, you can get this camera used probably for around $3,000, $3,100 or $3,200, maybe $3,200, maybe $200 more. And you get a used Sony A7R5 that has, number one, incredible EVF resolution. It has better resolution on the screen. It has the multi-angle screen with a flipping to all the sides. You also have plenty of buttons to customize, and you don't have that rinky-dinky new grip that you have to attach. This grip is also comfortable, and this grip is also deeper. Now, you have a front dial as well. You have a mode dial similar to the one on the Sony A7CR. This one actually actuates from the front, but you know, in my opinion, if I had $3,000, I would not be getting the Sony A7CR. Confusing. Because honestly, I mean, how much space am I saving? How much weight am I knocking off my camera? Honestly, not much. I'm actually holding these two cameras right now. I can tell the difference. Maybe this one a little bit lighter, but when it comes to weight, you know, I can tell the difference. Now, the other thing is that because this camera has a shallower grip and this one has a deeper grip, when you have heavier lenses, this camera is gonna feel lighter because the leverage that you have with a deeper grip, whereas this one, when I shoot with longer lenses, like, you know, very little area to grip on, and you know, that could be a problem. So again, guys, and that's gonna be the comparison. Now, for those that maybe are coming from APS-C or those that are coming from even Micro Four Third or other cameras, I would recommend you actually check the Sony A7C Mark I, specifically if you don't care about the 10-bit capability. It's a 24 megapixel sensor, great image quality, great low light performance in this camera. And I think the Sony A7C Mark I outperformed the Sony A7CR by far. Haven't done comparison, but you know, you have larger pixels here, still full frame. You have the same body of these new cameras. And to be honest with you, $2,200 for a Sony A7C Mark II, or maybe $1,100 or $1,000. I got my second body of the Sony A7C Mark I for $980 on OfferUp. So people are going to be offloading these cameras right now that these two cameras have been announced. So you can get one camera, or maybe you can get two cameras or a camera and a couple of lenses. So think about it, guys. Now, I'm not going to say that these cameras are bad. I am actually going to get the Sony A7C Mark II. I'm not getting the Sony A7CR because I already own the R5. And 33 megapixel is where I sat for me. And now with a 10-bit capability, the Sony A7CR is going to be the one that I'm going to get. And probably I'm going to be selling my two Sony A7C Mark I and just keeping one. And, you know, I got to offload this camera. By the way, if someone wants to buy my camera, I take great care of my cameras. Hit me in the comments or on Instagram at Gaston Shutter. So, guys, a lot to unpack. Will get the camera. I actually put a pre-order via Adorama. Thank you, Mike, if you're watching this video, because it goes live tomorrow. So I'm going to be getting this camera hopefully soon. I'm going to be an in-depth review. I'm going to be comparing it with the Sony A7C Mark I and these cameras that I mentioned before. But if you are, you know, trigger happy tonight and you're waiting for tomorrow, you place your order. Think about what I mentioned before. Think about how much diversity you want off your money, because you may be actually saving a lot of money and making a much wiser decision going with the other alternatives that I just mentioned before. Again, not knocking off these cameras, but I do think that they could have brought more to the table with the innovation, specifically with the EBF, specifically with the not so deep grip and not having a joystick. Those are things that I wanted to see at least on the R, but we don't have it. So guys, this is going to be it for today. I hope you had enjoyed this video, and be on the lookout for my in-depth review of the new Sony A7C Mark II versus this camera. Until then, I'll see you soon.